Hi there. I'm Auntie Sarah from CoffeeCraft, and I'm excited to bring you a new embroidery project today. With every project we complete at CoffeeCraft, we always try to stay inspired. You can be inspired by a family member, a friend, a pet, even yourself. As I work on my craft, I always try to keep in mind who I'm making this project for and what they mean to me. To me, being inspired by someone is the greatest compliment you can give, and keeping that person and their preferences in mind through the whole creation process is really what's going to make that project truly meaningful and honestly very special. Today's project is focusing on controlling your energy. We don't usually get to decide what events happen in our life, and we usually also don't get to decide our reaction to those events. What we do get to control is our response to those reactions. By choosing your energy for the day, I just want to remind myself and my friends that you get to decide if you're going to be a positive impact today or not. Even with all of the events that are going to happen today, you can decide to be positive. And sometimes I think we need that reminder. If this kind of message speaks to you, or if you're interested in learning some beginner embroidery skills, I hope you follow along with me. Grab yourself a hot cup of motivation, and let's roll up our sleeves and get started. The materials needed for today's project are embroidery hoop, some fabric, embroidery floss, a pattern, some scissors, a needle threader, a thimble, and an iron. So sometimes my fabric is pretty wrinkly, so I like to iron everything before I start, and then we move on to transferring the pattern. To begin the transfer of my pattern to my fabric, I first verify that the fabric is well centered to the hoop and the pattern is well centered to the fabric to make sure that I'll have enough fabric to tie off in the back once I'm finished. And then I'm just holding it up to a light source and tracing over with a water-soluble transfer marker. I'm going to get through all of the different letterings and designs to make sure that I can follow along with my stitching. You can see up close that this isn't extremely dark or anything. It's really just to make sure I can follow along as I stitch. So I am going back and I'm darkening a few spots that were a little not dark enough for me, but you could always use a pen or a heat transfer marker. Those are usually a little bit darker. But as long as you can tell what the plan is, that should be good enough. Next, we need to put the fabric in the hoop. So we are going to separate the hoop into the two pieces. And you just need to loosen up the little screw that's at the top of the hoop. And that should be loose enough so that you can get the bottom hoop out from the top hoop. I like to put the solid hoop underneath my project and then the tightening hoop on the outside of my project. So you can see I'm just centering and making sure that I'll be able to stitch around all of these spots. And I prefer to keep the tightening screw at the top of my project. Once I'm happy with the positioning of my pattern in the hoop, I then try to make sure it's pulled tautly. And you can see at the moment before tightening, there's a lot of flexibility in the fabric, and what we want to embroider is to tighten everything down. So we're going to start by tightening up that tension screw at the top of the hoop so that it's not loose, and then we're going to start just gently pulling on the fabric around the hoop and try to be as consistent as you can with this. We're just trying to get out any of that extra flexibility so that our stitches can be precise and consistent. But you don't want to pull too tight because then you risk pulling the fabric right out of the hoop, and it should sound like a little drum. And honestly, you shouldn't really be able to push and see your fingers push through from the back if it's tight enough. After the fabric is the correct level of tautness in the hoop, the next step is to thread your needle with some floss. So here you can see I have an assortment of embroidery needles. I'm picking probably one of the larger sizes because we're going to be working with 3 strands of embroidery floss today. So it's actually a pretty wide eye, but I still prefer to use a needle threader tool to help me do this. To get started, we need to measure out a good length of floss that we want to start with. I liked the color of this blue, so that's what I'm going to use for the lettering in this project today. So to start with, I always measure out about 1 forearm's worth of floss. Using that length as a general measurement has kept me from knotting and, making kind of a big mess in the back of my projects. It does mean that I have to, re-thread my needle more frequently, but with a needle threading tool, that's actually not really even a problem. We separate our 6-thread floss into 3 thread sections, and then we're just going to tie off the end of one of them. I just like to do a simple knot to do that to begin with. And now we're ready to actually thread our needle. So we're going to hold the needle in one hand, put the threader through the eye of the needle, and then we're going to thread the bigger loop in the tool with our floss here. Once that's through the bigger loop, we're just going to pull it right through the eye of the needle. That way we don't have to get all 3 strands right through the needle on the first try. The threader tool makes that a lot easier. So to begin, I'm going to use a backstitch on the lettering today. So we're going to start just a little bit away from the beginning of the pattern and then just stitch right back to the beginning. Now we're going to go a little bit further in the pattern and stitch back to that first stitch. And that's why it's called the back stitches. It's actually perpetually going a little bit further on the back side of your project to come back a shorter distance on the front to meet up with that exact stitch that you started with. And we're just going to do that same stitch pretty much through the whole section of the words. All right, so I've gotten a little bit further in my stitching here. And as you can see, I'm starting to get kind of low on the amount of floss I have left. It's only a few inches. And every once in a while, I've been just gently making sure that the fabric is the correct level of tautness in the hoop. But you can tell I've rolled some of that fabric up, and it's getting annoying now where I'm going to show you the fancy trick I've got for how I handle the excess fabric and making sure that I don't accidentally sew it to my project. I'm going to take an extra needle that I've got, just an embroidery needle. You could also use a pin or something else if you're a sewer. But I'm just going to roll the fabric right up to the edge of the outside of the hoop, and then I'm just going to pin it in place. And that'll help me make sure that I don't sew it right to the back of my project, and it's out of the way and easier for me to hold on to. Okay, so now you can see it's getting somewhat difficult to handle because I'm running out of floss, and it's about time for me to tie off. You have a few different choices for how to tie off. You could do what I'm doing in this example, which is just when you've got a couple inches left, you go to the back of the piece and you just tie a knot through a couple of the stitches from the previous stitches. And this works fine if you're just, going to make something that you hang on a wall and it's not going to go through a lot of wear and tear, and just make sure that it's tight and it's easy, right? But if you are going to do a lot more hand sewing, it would be good to practice actually not using knots at all. It's not the traditional method of sewing. Traditionally, you would just stitch back and forth in the same spot over and over, and by doing that, that creates a knot, and it's actually very strong too. So you might see that in a lot of other creators' content where they just actually never knot like I do. I mostly do it because I'm a fast creator sometimes, and it's fine as long as you're creating what you want to create, right? So Again, we're just gonna take our next piece of floss here. This is a 3-thread strand, just like before. It's the other half of our original floss section. And we're gonna thread it just like we did, where we thread the threading tool and then we pull that through. It's so easy. It's the best 50 cents I ever spent. I was getting a bunch of those threaders. So now to begin a new section, we again just start a little bit ahead of where we would begin from where we left off, and we just backstitch back to where we were. And now we're just going to continue this. And every time you come to a stop, or if you come to the end of a word, for example, you might willingly tie off before you've run out of floss, and that's okay. And we just keep doing this until we've reached the end of the words. All right, looks like I've reached the end of my last section here, and I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. My stitches are rather consistent, and if they're not this time for you, that's okay. If this is your first project, you should just be excited that you're practicing this new skill, and honestly, it's going to be better every time you do it. So I'm just going to tie off, just like I've been doing through this whole project, and then I'm going to prepare for the next step. So to make my words a little bit more bold and maybe smoothen out some of the stitches that I've created with the backstitch, I decided it would be fun to whip the backstitch. This might sound complicated, but honestly, it's super simple and I think quite intuitive. So we're going to start just like we did with the backstitch, where we're going to take, for example, here, I'm going to use the same color thread just to make it a little bit more bold. But you could use a different color thread and make it colorful and have a totally different vibe, right? But we're going to separate this into 3 strand sections again. We're going to thread our needle with our 3-strand section of floss. All right, once the needle is threaded, we're ready to go. To begin a whip of a backstitch, we're going to come through the project right at the beginning of where the stitches began, and we're just going to weave in and out of the back stitches. And here you can see I was debating if I was going to do left to right, and honestly, even if you mix it up, it's still going to look really cool. So I've decided I'm going to weave from the inside of my project to the outside, and it's just really quite interesting to see how this changes the look of your whole project here. So if you're looking for something that's really precise and thin, I recommend just doing a backstitch, but if you want to just bring it a little bit more boldness or smoothness, then this whipping technique is so cool, and it's really quite easy and quick too. So you're gonna get a lot further with the letters per section because you're not having to waste, floss coming back like you did with the back stitch, where it was further, more floss used on the back of the piece. This has pretty much no floss used on the back of the piece at all. We're not going through the fabric, we're just weaving in and out of the previous stitches that we've already made. So you can see that I'm getting really close to the end of my first word here, and I won't be able to continue whipping even though I have lots of floss. Where would I go after I reach the end of the E, right? So I'm going to have to tie off anyway, but this is a great spot to just tie it off, finish up the word, and you can see just the dramatic difference between the word choose and the word your energy. Just from adding this, it's so much more bold, so much more smooth, and really quite dramatic and eye-catching now. All right, now take a look at how the word choose looks like compared to your energy. It's so much more bold, so much more smooth. It's really quite eye-catching. So I'm really, really happy with how this whip stitch is turning out. So as you can see, I've finished both backstitching and whip stitching all of the letters in my pattern, and we're pretty much halfway there now. So the other parts of my design include a few stars in the background, and I've got a few variation on the size and the design here, and I'm going to use a couple of different colors just to bring some variance to the design. So for example, I wanted to show you a different type of floss. This is a single strand floss that you can buy just on a spool. I chose silver for this because it felt a little bit magical. So this we don't need to separate at all because it's already a single strand and it's pretty quick to work with. Okay, so the first star I wanted to start with was one of the top stars, and it's just a simple, I did a back stitch across all these lines just to outline it, and I think it looks so pretty. And it's really easy too. Very simple, just follow the lines as long as they are, stitch right over them. Oh, you can see this is an example of what happens when things start to knot. Don't pull too hard on the front, verify what's going on the back, maybe pull on the back a little bit to straighten it out. All right, so since the next star was pretty close, I decided not to tie off, just to essentially go over. And, you know, I also thought this was a good option because my fabric is a pretty close color to the floss that I'm using. But the stitch I just completed is called the French knot. And what you do is you pull your needle through, you wrap the floss around your needle, 5 to 10 times maybe. And then you just push that needle right back in very close to where you had put it through initially. Make sure you keep your floss taut through that whole maneuver, and that'll have a nice, small, beautiful row-shaped knot, really. The next star I'm working on is an outline. I just did a back stitch all the way around the outline of the star here. And the star after that is another outline where I'm just stitching all around it. You can see a little bit up close here. I'm just trying to cover up all those marks that I made. If you didn't use a erasable or water-soluble marker when you did the transfer, you're going to want to make sure that you're choosing a floss color that is dark enough to cover whatever it is you use to mark it, whether that was a pencil, a marker, a pen, whatever. And if the floss isn't dark enough to cover it, I recommend making sure that you stitch on the outside of your markings and then always fill it. But I really like the variance of doing some stars that are filled with a satin stitch and some that are just not filled, because, not everything is the same all of the time. So you can see that I've moved on to my second color here. I decided to do both silver and gold, and I'm starting with a French knot, again with a couple of wraps around the needle, and then push it right back through almost where it came out initially from the fabric. Then you keep the floss nice and taut and you pull the needle through your fabric, and that creates a beautiful little knot. This star I'm going to describe to you, since you can see it a little better, how to complete the satin stitch. To start with, I always recommend outlining your shape that you're going to be satin stitch filling with the back stitch all around it as an outline. This will help you get some volume when you do your satin stitch across your back stitch here. And it will make sure that, you have a great line to work from that's filled with the same color. All right, once you've completed your outline, we're going to actually begin satin stitching, and that's really just filling the space all the way across. So we're going to start on one side of your shape. We're going to come up through the front of the fabric, then we're going to come down through your fabric on the other side of it, and we're just going to work from the top of the shape all the way to the bottom. You want to stitch as closely as possible to the previous satin stitch. That will make sure that you have the best coverage and color. And, embroidery pieces are 3D pieces of art, and a lot of times people will feel them, right? Keeping your stitches in the same direction and having them as close together as possible will have them feel the smoothest, and they will look just like satin, for example. All right, if you've made it this far, that means that we've gotten to the end of actually stitching. So we have everything from the pattern covered at this point. So we're just going to use either water or abrasive or heat to erase whatever your markings were. If you get to this point and you realize that you still see your markings, or let's say you used Sharpie and it bled a little bit, I just recommend going back with a little bit more floss and outlining your piece. Outline whatever it is that's still visible from your mark, and it'll just make things a little bit more bold. So here I used a water-soluble marker to transfer my pattern, and I'm a little bit impatient and I'd like to see what this looks like soon, so I decided to use my hairdryer just on a very low temperature and low speed and dry out my fabric a little quicker. But you can always just lay this out overnight and it'll dry plenty fast enough. All right, my piece is dry enough for me to continue working with, and I'm loving how it's looking. Since I'm going to keep this piece in the hoop that it's in, I'm going to trim around the fabric that's excess, probably about 3 inches or just a couple of fingers all the way around. If you are not sure that this piece will stay in a hoop, then I recommend not trimming your fabric. Keep it in a square or whatever weird shape you started with. That way you have the most capability of taking it out of the hoop and then reattaching it to whatever it is that you wanted to put this on, whether you want to have this on a pillow, or maybe you're gonna patch it onto maybe like a piece of clothing or a hat. So if you're not sure about what you're gonna do, feel free to leave the excess fabric. I know that I'm gonna keep it in a hoop, so I'm gonna trim it now. Once you're ready to begin closing up the back here, we're going to take a 4 arms length section of floss. I just continued with the extra piece I had from the last set of stitches, and we're going to do a running stitch about 1 inch away from the edge of the fabric all the way around. And that way when we pull it tight, it'll just close up like a cinch in a bag. So to begin a running stitch, we're going to start from the outside or the front facing piece, and we're just going to weave our needle in and out of the fabric, catching a few pinches of fabric at one time on the needle. And then once we have enough, we're going to pull the needle all the way through, and you should be able to pretty easily pull the floss all the way through your fabric. And this is just such a quick way to get some stitches in your fabric. You can use this running stitch in embroidery or even just hand sewing something really quickly. This is a great technique to practice. So I've gotten near the end of my running stitch here, and what we're just going to do is take both ends of the floss and we're going to pull them both tight. And you can see all the excess fabric has been pulled to the back. If you did not trim your fabric before getting to this point, you will want to add a couple more stitches once we get around to the end of this circle back into the corners or excess sections of fabric, and just continue a running stitch right through them. And make sure that you just tie it off somewhere on that piece so that, if you're prepared to move it from a hoop into something else, you just gotta clip your floss anywhere in this running stitch and you should be able to easily pull it out. That's the other beauty about the running stitch, is it's great for a temporary sewing as well. So if this is still too messy looking for your eyes and it will bug you even knowing that this is going against a wall, you do have an option of taking some felt and cutting it to about the same size as the hoop. For example, this is a 7-inch hoop, so you just cut a 7-inch circle, and you could just either sew it to your fabric here, or you could hot glue it. That would work too. If you're using a fabric and you feel like it's really see-through and you don't like seeing all the different stitches that maybe are running around in the back from the front, and you are able to see that, another option is to take another couple pieces of felt and put them inside your hoop here, and that'll give a more opaque look to your fabric. I'm pretty happy with how this looks, and I'm excited to hang this on my wall. So I'm just going to take a little section of floss and I'm going to tie it to my tightening screw, and that's going to be how I hang it on the wall. Well, if you've made it this far in the video, I firstly want to thank you for joining me. This kind of content is something that I truly enjoy making, and I hope that you enjoyed watching as well. If you did really like this content and you're interested in learning even more and maybe taking a look at a written form of this project in a tutorial, head over to coffeecrafters.org. I've got a few gifts for the different skills that we use today. I like to call those the grounds of my coffee craft because, you know, the same way that grounds are essential to having a quality coffee, these skills are essential to having a quality embroidery project. I also have an Instagram account, so I've linked that in the description below. If you are inspired by this and you decide to make something for your friends or family or for yourself, I'd love to see whatever creations you come up with, so feel free to tag me in that, and I'll definitely respond. Thanks again for joining me today. I hope I see you next time as we work on a new craft, a different craft, something fun. All right, bye.